Hello, I'm Pete Sims, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk at the Education Conflict Emergency Seminar. It's fantastic that education emergencies is so recognised now at the IOE. It was talked about a lot when I was there, and it was an interest that a lot of people had and had worked in. So it's great to see that it's now got a lot of recognition at the institute and as part of the degree programs there. Apologies that I can't be there, obviously, because this is pre-recorded. I'm in Afghanistan, or I will be at that time, hopefully, unless something goes wrong, something terrible happens, which is always on the cards, obviously. But anyway, touch wood, everything will be fine. And I was just asked to give a little bit about myself, my background, and then also about my experiences in terms of the education conflict sector and so forth, education emergencies, conflict, protracted crises, whatever you might call it. And I've already used up a minute of the time that Andrew gave me, so I should probably crack on. I was at the university, I was at the IOE now, which is now part of the UCL, which it wasn't then. So anyway, I was at the IOE a few years ago, and I joined the IOE because I was particularly interested in learning a bit more about the theory behind education. I'd been a teacher for several years and then moved into teacher training, largely abroad. So I worked in China and in Russia and in Jordan and then Iraq. Spent a lot of that time with the British Council. I was particularly interested in Iraq and development contexts and this kind of thing, and I started to have a few ideas about how education should be or could be delivered from a state, and certain principles about that. And I was interested to go and sort of and learn more about those and test those theories out and see if that made any sense at all, really. So the IOE was absolutely the best place for that. There's not that many places that do it. There's a handful. There's a couple in the US, a couple in Canada, a couple in the UK, and a couple here in Europe. But that's about it, really. So it's a fantastic place, and I really loved it. And it did crystallise my thoughts and my opinions on education, and that I would then go out and be able to, see and test out in the world. After graduation, I applied for lots of jobs. I didn't particularly want to go back to what I'd worked in before, so I wanted to try something different. Applied for lots and lots of jobs, and as everyone does, and it takes a long time, or sometimes it takes a short time, but usually it takes a long time. But you always get something, and I did. I finally managed to get a job. I worked for UNESCO I knew this at UNICEF then, UNESCO in Indonesia. And I was working on a program called Education for Sustainable Development, which was fascinating. And sustainable development, as you probably know now, that it's such a global issue in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, it pretty much encapsulates everything from poverty to climate change. So it was a big program, and I don't know if we were particularly successful, but it was an interesting one. A big thing for me was that working in Indonesia, that's a kind of context, a middle income country, and they've still got a lot of education challenges, but they're aware of them, and the ministry knows what to do, and they didn't really need us there saying, how about this, what do you think about this, you should do this. They'll get around to it when they can prioritise it, when they have the money. So it was an interesting role to play there, and not an entirely positive one the entire time. So I was interested to go somewhere where maybe a more direct development context. So I moved to a different field office for UNESCO in Afghanistan, and was there for about a year, and then moved back to the UK to spend more time here. But I managed to get a job as a program manager for an organisation, an NGO here called Children in Crisis, that works in conflict and post-conflict countries. So I oversee the Afghanistan program, so I travel back and forth, hence being there now. That's been a fascinating experience. Afghanistan is a very challenging context for lots of very obvious reasons. In terms of education, it's not like somewhere, for example, Iraq, or potentially like Syria might be at some point, hopefully in the not too distant future, where it's a case of largely rebuilding a system of education that was there before, or sort of covering over some gaps that have been eroded. Afghanistan didn't have any of that. There wasn't a system, and so it was about the creation of one from nothing. And that's been very, very interesting. And then you've got the emergency in the conflict environment of huge numbers of refugees, people leaving and then people coming back again at various different times. Massive internal displacement, up to about half of the country at some point has been displaced. So considerable challenges there, not even getting into issues of money and of safety, which are of course considerable as well. So it was a very interesting context, and the biggest thing that I learned, and I'm still learning about that, is, and it relates directly to something like a conflict or emergency situation, is you can build some schools, or you can build some temporary schools, and you can train some teachers, and you can buy some books, but that's not necessarily enough. That would be a sort of a supply of education solution, but as it turns out in somewhere like Afghanistan, the demand isn't really there, or hasn't been there for obvious reasons, and people haven't gone to school. There isn't the recognition, the knowledge, and the belief that education is important, the value of it, the intrinsic value outside of even the instrumental value that it might be useful and necessary for skills and so forth, especially if there aren't many jobs and that kind of thing. So it really needs coming out of both sides, and it's incredibly difficult to do. And then doing that in the case of having, for example, limited access to basic resources as well, and limited money and time is incredibly challenging. So it's fascinating, and I enjoy it very much, but it's very, very difficult. In terms of the sector as a whole, and before I get on, I'm on the part of the Interagency Network on education emergencies, the INEE, and I'm on one of a working group with them around education fragility, which is very interesting because it allows us to develop more global advocacy and some global policies and best practices around these kind of things. I'm sure you've heard of the INEE, and it's a fantastic organisation to join. If you haven't joined, I would recommend being part of them. So there is a movement, and this moves on to the next point, which is around the challenges and opportunities in the field or in the sector at the moment. And I think after for years and years, from sort of 2000, the start of INEE, until about a few years ago, it was just about advocacy, just about getting education emergencies on the map and getting basic supplies of education into the standard humanitarian context of refugee camps or something like that. That's now recognised, and at least in a policy sense, even if not in a funding one. The next part is about recognising the bigger challenges, which is that conflicts now, protracted crises, tend to last a minimum of 10 years. That means you've got to supply something larger for people in terms of services, in terms of basic services in that area, and education is invaluable in that sense, not just again as in terms of the skills that might be developed, but the psychosocial learning, and that's a big thing that UNICEF now are really pushing. There's a lot of good work around that, and the psychosocial benefits as well, and the safety, the protection side. So education emergencies now often, and again, for example, in humanitarian funding, it can be included or comes under the protection stuff. So I recommend looking into the protection clusters and that kind of thing while at the IOE, because it's certainly something that comes up in terms of emergency settings. And otherwise, there's the issue of money in terms of funding. The EU has always claimed to want to put 4% of its humanitarian funding, and that's not very much, into education. It's never done more than about 2%, but this year they've re-pledged to do 4%. So we'll see what happens, and with luck that'll go forward. There has been a momentum to get a greater recognition. The money will hopefully flow after that. So we'll see what happens. But there is an acknowledgement that it's important. There's about 58 million children who are out of primary education, and about up to 2/3 of those, as an estimate, are in protracted crises or conflict settings or emergency settings of any type. So it's not really that the issue of out-of-school children, for example, to access to basic education is a conflict issue. It is an emergency issue. So they can't be sort of considered separately, or education emergencies isn't just a little part of a wider problem. It is actually the part. It is the central one, and I think there's more understanding of that, and it'll be really interesting to see how that goes in the next year. I can see I've already gone way over the time that I was supposed to talk for. So thank you again for allowing me to speak, and I'm very much hoping, and I'm sure I'll see many of you in the field at some point, and hopefully very soon. So thank you again. Bye.